The morning sun rose slow and red over Wolf Creek Valley, painting the long grass the color of old copper. A lone rider crested the ridge above the north pasture, his silhouette cut sharp against the Wyoming sky. Nathaniel Hollister sat tall in the saddle, his shoulders wide beneath a worn canvas duster, his face shadowed by the brim of a brown felt hat that had seen 10 winters. He was 32 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of a man twice that. They were gray, the color of river stones in winter, and they missed nothing. Below him, the valley spread out like a green and gold quilt. 300 acres of Hollister land, the Lazy H Ranch, fenced and worked and bled for. To the south, the small ranch belonging to Tobias Brennan, an old widower who had lived in this valley longer than Nate had been alive. To the east, the Peterson place, abandoned 3 months ago after Pacific mining men had visited the Petersons one too many times. Nate had ridden over the morning after the Petersons left and found the front door swinging on broken hinges. He had not gone back. A sound carried up from below, the crack of a rifle, then another. Nate did not hesitate. He spurred his bay gelding hard down the slope, one hand falling to the Colt revolver at his hip. The horse knew this rider and knew this kind of riding. They covered the half-mile to the Brennan place in less than 2 minutes. What he saw when he came around the cottonwood grove made his blood run cold and steady at the same time. 3 men on horseback had Tobias Brennan backed up against the wall of his own barn. The old man stood with his hands raised, his white hair catching the morning light, his face the color of bone. At his feet lay a black and white sheepdog, motionless in the dust. The animal had been shot through the chest. Tobias had raised the dog from a pup. Nate knew that dog by name, Old Shep. The leader of the 3 men was tall and raw-boned, with a long scar running from his left ear down to the corner of his mouth. He sat his horse the way a man sits a chair, comfortable and careless, a piece of paper in one hand and a pistol in the other. He was speaking to Tobias in a low voice that did not quite carry, but Nate did not need to hear the words. He knew the words. He had heard them before in different mouths in different places. The words were always the same when men came to take what was not theirs. Nate drew his rifle from the saddle scabbard in one slow motion. He did not raise it. He let it rest across his thighs, the brass receiver catching the sun. Then he walked his horse forward into the open, easy and unhurried, like a man riding home for breakfast. The 3 men saw him. The scar-faced one turned in his saddle, and his hand tightened on his pistol, but he did not raise it. He was measuring. Nate measured back. "Morning," Nate said. His voice was quiet. It traveled the way a river travels, slow and certain. "You boys lost." The scar-faced man smiled. "Not lost, friend. Just doing some business with Mr. Brennan here. Private business. Maybe you ought to keep riding." Nate let his eyes drift down to the dead dog, then back up. That dog belonged to Tobias. He raised her from a pup. 8 years he had her. Dog should not have come at us. Dog was tied to that post, Nate said. "I can see the rope from here." The smile faded. The 3 men shifted in their saddles. Nate could see the youngest one, a kid no more than 20 with a bad case of nerves, sliding his hand toward his own gun. Nate let his rifle slide a half-inch on his thighs, just enough so the muzzle pointed in the kid's general direction. The kid stopped moving. "You know who we work for?" Mr. the scar-faced man asked. His voice had lost its friendliness now. "I have a guess. We work for Pacific Mining Consortium. And Pacific Mining gets what it wants, one way or the other." "I have heard that," Nate said. "I have also heard that the men who run that company have never set foot in this valley. They send other men, men like you, men who shoot old dogs and threaten old farmers. I wonder how they sleep at night." "I wonder how you sleep at night." The scar-faced man's face went hard. "You got a name, friend," Hollister, Nate said. "Lazy H, north of here." Something flickered in the scar-faced man's eyes. Recognition. He had heard the name. He had been told to remember the name. Nate saw all of that pass across the man's face in the space of a heartbeat, and he knew what was coming next. He raised the rifle in one smooth motion, sighted, fired. The bullet took the scar-faced man's hat clean off his head and sent it spinning into the dust. The man jerked back so hard he nearly fell from his saddle. His own pistol came up, but Nate was already working the lever. The next round chambered the rifle pointed dead center on the man's chest. The next one goes through your heart, Nate said, real soft. The next one after that goes through your friend on the left, then your friend on the right. I can work this lever faster than you can pull that trigger. You want to find out? The scar-faced man stared at him for a long moment. Then he slowly raised his free hand palm out. He lowered the pistol. He spoke without taking his eyes off Nate. Boys, we are leaving. The two others did not need to be told twice. They wheeled their horses and started back up the road. The scar-faced man lingered. He looked at Nate the way a man looks at a debt that is going to come due someday. Hollister, he said, remember my face. My name is Silas Crawford. You and me, we are not done. I will remember, Nate said. Crawford spat tobacco juice into the dust at the feet of Nate's horse. Then he turned and rode after his men. Nate sat there in the saddle until the three of them disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower the rifle. Tobias Brennan had not moved. The old man stood by the dead dog, tears running down the lines of his weathered face, his hands still trembling. Nate dismounted slow and walked over. He knelt beside the dog and laid one hand on her side, brief and gentle. Then he stood. I am sorry about Shep, he said. Tobias could not speak. He just nodded over and over like a man trying to convince himself the world was still turning. Nate helped the old man bury the dog beneath a cottonwood by the creek. They worked in silence. When it was done, Tobias finally found his voice. Nate, he said, you should not have come. They will come for you next. They were already coming for me, Nate said. They have been coming for me for 6 months. He looked back across the valley toward his own ranch, toward the rooftop of the Lazy H, just visible through the morning haze. Today they just made it personal. He rode home slow. He had things to think about. That evening after supper, the 4 Hollister brothers and one old man sat on the wide front porch of the ranch house and watched the sun go down behind the Laramie Mountains. The sky was the color of a blacksmith's forge, all orange and ember red fading to purple along the eastern horizon. A meadowlark sang somewhere in the long grass and then went still. Nate had told them everything. He had told them about Crawford and the maw and the threat. Now he sat in the rocking chair his father had built 40 years ago and stared out at the land his family had broken with their own hands. Beside him in another rocker sat old Henry McCritty. Henry was 66 years old. His hair was the color of fresh snow and the left side of his face carried a scar where shrapnel had taken his eye at the siege of Petersburg in the spring of 1865. The empty socket was covered by a black leather patch tied behind his head with a thin cord. His remaining eye, the right one, was a clear pale blue, and it had the steadiness of a man who had seen everything the world could throw at him and was no longer surprised by any of it. Henry had been with Nate since the war. He had ridden west with the boy when the boy had nothing but a horse and a heart full of ghosts. He had stayed because there was nowhere else he wanted to be. At the porch railing, leaning back with his arms crossed, stood Tobias Hollister, 29 years old. The family called him Toby. He was the second son and the warmest of the brothers, with a quick smile and brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. He was the man the wild horses came to when no one else could touch them. He had a way of standing very still and speaking very softly and watching, just watching, until the horse decided he was safe. Toby applied that same patience to his brothers. Sitting on the porch step, cleaning his revolver with a piece of oiled cloth, was Jonah Hollister, 26. Jonah was the third brother and the quietest. He had been a deputy sheriff in Dodge City for 2 years until a man he had been chasing had run into a hotel where a woman was crossing the lobby with a child in her arms. Jonah had fired and his bullet had gone where it was supposed to go, but a piece of wood splinter from the doorframe had caught the child's cheek and left a scar there forever. The child had lived. The child was probably married now with children of her own. But Jonah had hung up his star the same week and ridden home, and he had not spoken much since. He kept his coat clean and his eyes moving and his mouth shut, and he watched over his brothers with the silent intensity of a wolf watching over its pack. The youngest Hollister, Ezra, was 19. He sat on the floor of the porch with his back against the wall, a book open on his knees, his blond hair falling into his eyes. Ezra was the only one of the four brothers who had not been hardened by the world yet, and his older brothers worked very hard to keep it that way. He read books about animals and dreamed of being a veterinarian. He talked to the horses as if they were old friends. He had never killed a man, never even drawn his gun in anger, and in the small church of the Hollister brothers, that fact was sacred. For a long time, none of them spoke. The sun went down behind the mountains. The first stars came out. Old Henry was the one who finally broke the silence. He spoke without looking at Nate, his good eye fixed on some far point in the dusk. "You remember what I told you at Petersburg, son?" Nate shifted in his rocker. "I remember. I told you a man without something to fight for is already half dead. You were 17 years old and you had just watched your platoon get cut to pieces and you wanted to die. You were ready to walk out into the field and let it take you. I dragged you back behind that earthworks and I told you to find a reason to keep breathing. Do you remember what you said to me?" Nate was quiet for a long moment. "I said I would find one." "You have been looking for 14 years, Henry said. You found Lenora and you loved her and you lost her, and then the looking stopped. You buried her 3 years ago and you have been just existing ever since. Working this land like it could fill the hole. It cannot fill the hole. Nothing fills the hole except another life." Toby looked over at his older brother. He did not say anything. Jonah kept cleaning his revolver, but his hands had slowed. Even Ezra had looked up from his book. Henry turned his good eye on Nate now. "Crawford was just the start, son. They are going to come back. They are going to come back with more men and bigger guns, and they are going to do to you what they did to the Petersons. And when they do, you and your brothers will fight them, because that is what the Hollister men do. You will fight them, and maybe you will win, and maybe you will lose. But either way, the four of you will be standing here alone. There is no future in that. There has to be more than the four of you. There has to be a reason for any of this, a real reason." "What are you saying, Henry?" "I am saying it is time you got married again." The words sat on the porch like a stone dropped into a quiet pond. Toby raised his eyebrows. Jonah did not look up, but his cleaning cloth had stopped moving entirely. Ezra stared. Nate did not answer for a long time. When he did, his voice was rough. "There is no woman in this valley. I want to marry Henry, and I will not court a woman just to have her. Lenore deserved better than that. Whoever came next would deserve better than that." "Then write a letter," Henry said. "A letter. Write a letter to the newspaper in Cheyenne. There are women back east who answer such letters. Honest women, Nate. Women looking for a fresh start. You are an honest man with an honest ranch and 3 good brothers. You write the letter and you tell the truth and you let God send you who he sends you. That is all I am asking." "Mail order," Toby said quietly from the railing. He was not laughing. None of them were laughing. "I have heard it called worse," Henry said. Nate stared out at the dark valley for a long time. He thought about Lenora. He thought about the empty side of the bed he had not slept on in 3 years. He thought about the way the kitchen of the ranch house had not smelled like baking bread since the winter of 1876. He thought about Ezra, who had been 10 when their mother died, and had not really had a mother since. He thought about old Henry, who would not live forever, and about what would happen to this family when the old soldier was gone. "I will think about it," he said. Henry nodded once slow. Then he stood up from his rocker, wincing a little as the old wound in his hip reminded him of the war. He laid his hand on Nate's shoulder for just a moment as he passed. "You are a good man, Nathaniel Hollister," he said. "Do not waste yourself." He went inside. The screen door creaked shut behind him. Nate sat on the porch a long time after the others had gone in. He sat until the moon rose over the eastern hills and washed the valley in silver. Then he went inside, lit a lamp at the kitchen table, took out a sheet of paper and a pencil, and began to write. 2 weeks later in Philadelphia, a young woman knelt on the cold tile floor of the Brennan Hotel kitchen and scrubbed at a stain that would not come out. The water in her bucket had gone the color of weak tea. Her hands were red and cracked, the knuckles bleeding in 3 places, where the lye soap had eaten through her skin. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. The kitchen was lit by a single oil lamp on the long wooden table, and the only sound in the whole big building was the soft scrape of her brush against the floor. Her name was Abigail Sinclair. She was 21 years old and she had been awake for 20 hours. Abby finished the corner she was working on, sat back on her heels, and pressed the back of one wrist against her forehead. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and was sticking to her cheeks. She was thin, too thin. She had been thin for 2 years now, ever since the letter came from Colorado, telling her that her father was dead. She closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought she could rest them for a count of 10 and then keep going. She made it to 4 before the kitchen door banged open and Mr. Murphy walked in. Murphy ran the saloon where she worked her third shift. He was a heavy man with small, wet eyes and a way of looking at women that made Abby want to wash her skin afterward. He was not supposed to be at the hotel at this hour. He had no business here. But Murphy went where he pleased. Abigail, he said. He stood over her, blocking the lamplight, casting his shadow across her like a stain. We need to talk about your debt, girl. I gave you $40 last Friday, Mr. Murphy. That was everything I had. $40 is not enough. The interest alone is more than that. Your father owed $1,000 when he died, and you have been paying it off in pennies. I am tired of pennies, girl. She stood up slowly. Her knees ached. Her back ached. Her eyes burned with exhaustion. I will pay you, she said. I will find a way. You will, Murphy said. Then he smiled, and the smile was the worst thing she had seen all year. There are men in Baltimore who pay good money for a girl who is still pure, I asked around. They would give me $300 for you, maybe more. That would clear most of what you owe. You think about that, Abigail. You think about it real careful between now and the end of this month. Because if I do not see $200 on my counter by the last day of October, I am putting you on a train to Baltimore myself. He turned and walked out. The kitchen door banged shut behind him. Abby stood very still in the lamplight for a long time. She did not cry. She had stopped being able to cry sometime in the second year. She just stood there holding her wet brush and feeling something inside her chest finish breaking apart. She walked out of the hotel at 10 minutes after 4. The streets of Philadelphia were empty and dark. She walked the 8 blocks to her boarding house with her head down and her arms wrapped around her thin coat. In her rented room, she did not light the lamp. She knelt by her narrow bed and pulled out the small wooden box where she kept the things that mattered. There were not many things. A daguerreotype of her mother who had died when Abby was 11. Her father's pocket watch broken. A small leather Bible. And folded at the bottom of the box, a torn page from a Wyoming newspaper that a traveling salesman had left at the saloon 2 months ago. She unfolded the page. She had read the small notice so many times the paper was soft along the creases. An honest Wyoming rancher, 32 years old, a widower, was seeking a God-fearing woman of good character for honorable marriage. He had 3 brothers and a working ranch and promised fair treatment. She was to reply to Nathaniel Hollister at the Lazy H Ranch in Wolf Creek, Wyoming territory. Abby stared at the words for a long time. Then she got up, lit her lamp, took out a sheet of paper, and began to write. The letters went back and forth 4 times in 4 weeks. They were not love letters. They were the careful, honest letters of 2 people who had been through too much to lie. Abby wrote that she had never been courted, that she could read and write and keep books, that she could cook and sew, and was not afraid of hard work. She wrote that she did not know how to ride a horse and had never fired a gun. She wrote that she was a Quaker by upbringing, but no longer a perfect one, because life had taught her that some things were worth fighting for, and not all violence was a sin. She wrote that her father was dead and she had no family. Nate wrote back about the ranch, about his three brothers, each one a little, about old Henry who had saved his life in the war. He wrote about Lenore without flinching. He told Abby that he was not looking for a replacement for the woman he had lost because no woman could be that and it would be unfair to ask. He was looking, he wrote, for a partner, a friend, someone to share the kitchen and the table in the long winter evenings. He told her that he could not promise her love because love was a thing that grew or did not grow on its own time, but he could promise her safety and respect in a roof that would never leak. The fourth letter came with a train ticket, Philadelphia to Cheyenne, third class, dated October 14th, 1879. With it came $30 in folded bills and a short note. He said he would meet her at the Cheyenne station on the 15th of October. He would be wearing a brown hat and carrying a yellow wildflower so she would know him. If she changed her mind, he would not blame her. But he wanted her to know one thing. There she would never scrub a floor for a wicked man again. The note was signed simply Nathaniel Hollister. Abby read those last two lines 3 times. Then she put the note down on her bed and pressed both hands against her face and wept for the first time in 2 years. She sold her mother's wedding ring to a pawnbroker the next morning. It brought her enough to pay Murphy $200 on the last day of October, the day before she got on the train. She walked into the saloon at noon, laid the money on the bar, and walked out without saying a word. She did not look back. She would never see Philadelphia again. The train ride west took 8 days. Abby spent most of it pressed against the window of her third-class car, watching the country change. The neat green farms of Pennsylvania gave way to the flat black soil of Ohio, then Indiana, then the long brown plains of Illinois and Iowa where the wind blew so hard she could hear it through the glass, then Nebraska where the sky got bigger every hour and the towns got smaller. Then on the 7th day, the first hint of mountains rising in the west like a low blue cloud bank that never moved. By the 8th day, she could feel the air thinning. Wyoming. The train pulled into Cheyenne Station at 2 in the afternoon on October 15th. Abby stepped down onto the platform with her one small trunk and her heart beating so loudly in her ears she could barely hear the conductor calling the stops. The platform was crowded with men in long coats and women in calico and boys selling newspapers and one drunk soldier sleeping against a wall. Abby looked for a brown hat and a yellow flower. She did not see one. She stood there for a long time. 5 minutes. 10. The crowd thinned. Her heart began to do something cold and sharp in her chest. She thought he has changed his mind. He has decided I am not worth meeting. I have come 2,000 miles to a place I do not know to meet a man who is not here. Then a voice spoke behind her, low and gentle. Miss Sinclair. She turned. A man stood there, hat in his hands. He was not wearing a brown hat. He was holding a brown hat. He was younger than she had expected, no more than 30, with brown eyes that crinkled at the corners in a slow, careful smile. In his other hand, he held a yellow wildflower, slightly wilted from the long ride into town. He was tall and lean and dressed in a worn canvas jacket and dusty trousers. I am Tobias Hollister, he said. Nate's brother. The folks call me Toby. Abby's breath caught. Where is he? Toby's face went serious. He set his hat back on his head. He laid his right hand flat against his chest over his heart. Miss Sinclair, he said, I want you to know my brother did not break his word lightly. 2 days ago, a band of riders was driving stolen cattle off our North Range. We think they were sent by the same outfit that has been giving us trouble. Nate and our brother Jonah went out at dawn yesterday to track them. Nate sent me to Cheyenne in his place because he could not be in 2 places at once. He has been losing sleep over it. He told me to swear to you on the Hollister name that he meant no insult, so I am swearing it now. He held the wilted flower out to her. He picked this himself. He told me the color reminded him of the way the cottonwoods turn in October. Abby took the flower. Her hand was trembling. Something in her chest, some hard, cold thing she had been carrying since the morning Murphy had threatened her, began to crack. Not break, just crack. Just enough to let in a thin sliver of light. "Thank you, Mr. Hollister." "Toby," he said. "We are going to be family, Miss Sinclair. You should call me Toby." He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He led her to a buckboard wagon hitched outside the station. He helped her up onto the seat with the careful courtesy of a man who had been raised right. He climbed up beside her, took the reins, and clucked to the team. They rolled out of Cheyenne and turned north onto the long road that led into the mountains. The journey to Wolf Creek Valley took 2 days. They stopped that night at a small roadhouse run by a Norwegian widow named Mrs. Halverson. Toby paid for 2 separate rooms. When Abby went up to bed, she heard Toby drag a wooden chair into the hallway and settle himself in it outside her door. She lay awake for a while, listening. She could hear him breathing. Once she heard him cough quietly. He was guarding her door. He had not asked. He had not made a show of it. He had simply done it because she was a woman alone in a strange place, and he was a Hollister brother, and that was what a Hollister brother did. Abby cried into her pillow that night, quietly so he would not hear. She did not even know exactly why. She had not been treated with that kind of plain decency in such a long time that it broke something open in her she had thought was already broken. They rode all the next day. Toby talked to her as the wagon rolled, his voice easy and unhurried, painting pictures of the family and the ranch she was about to enter. He told her about Nate first, about the war, about how Nate had been 17 years old and had lied about his age to join the Union Army in the spring of 1864 because his father had told him a man fights for what he believes in. He told her about the Wilderness Campaign and the long bloody siege of Petersburg and how old Henry had carried Nate out from under fire when a shell took the top off the earthworks where the boy was standing. He told her about Lenora, who had been a school teacher in Cheyenne and had married Nate 2 years after the war. He told her that Lenora had died in childbirth in the winter of 1876, and the baby had died with her, and Nate had not been the same since. He told her about himself next, about the horses, about a girl in Cheyenne he had once thought he might marry, who had run off with a card sharp from St. Louis, and broken his heart so cleanly, he was almost grateful for the cleanness of the break. He laughed when he said it, but Abby heard the old hurt under the laugh. He told her about Jonah, the third brother, about Dodge City and the splinter and the child's scar. He told her how Jonah had ridden home and had not slept a full night since. He told her about Ezra last. He told her with a kind of fierce gentleness that made Abby's eyes sting. "Ezra is the youngest," he said. "He is the one we have all been working hardest to keep good. He reads books. He loves the animals. He cried for 2 days when our mother died, and Nate sat with them both nights. We need Ezra to stay the way he is, Miss Sinclair. The world is hard out here. We need at least one of us to still believe in soft things." "And old Henry McCready," Toby said finally. "Henry is 66 years old, and he is not really our blood, but he is more our father than our father ever was. He came west with Nate after the war. He has been with us longer than Ezra has been alive. He runs the horses with me, and he tells the old stories on winter nights, and he is the one who finally talked Nate into writing the letter that brought you here. So when you meet him, Miss Sinclair, be patient with him. He has only got one eye and a bad hip and a sharp tongue, but he is the best man any of us know." Abby listened. She did not say much. She did not need to. She was learning these men through Toby's words, and she was understanding for the first time that she was not riding toward a husband. She was riding toward a family. The wagon crested a low rise on the morning of the second day, and Wolf Creek Valley opened up below them. Abby drew in a breath she had not known she was holding. The valley was wet and golden in the autumn light, threaded by a creek that caught the sun like a length of silver wire. At the far end stood a 2-story log house with smoke rising from its chimney. Behind it, 2 large barns. To one side, a paddock where a dozen horses grazed. Beyond that, the long grass rolling away to the foot of the Laramie Mountains, which stood blue and white capped against the sky. "That is the Lazy H," Toby said quietly. "That is home." Abby could not speak. She had not believed a place like this existed. She had spent 2 years in a city where the air was gray and the sky was a strip of dirty cloth between the rooftops. And now she was looking at a sky so wide it made her dizzy. They rode down into the valley. As the wagon approached the house, 4 figures came out onto the porch and stood waiting in a rough line. Abby could see them clearly now. The tallest of the 4 men wore a brown hat. He took it off as the wagon pulled up and held it against his chest and stepped down from the porch. Behind him, a younger man with watchful eyes stood with his hand resting near his belt. A boy, almost a boy, blond and grinning shyly. And beside them, leaning on a hand-carved walking stick, an old man with snow-white hair and a black patch over his left eye. Nate Hollister walked up to the side of the wagon. He looked up at Abby. His gray eyes were grave and tired and kind all at once. He said her name. Miss Sinclair, Mr. Hollister. I am sorry I was not at the station, he said. I am ashamed to have made you arrive without me there. Will you accept my apology? I will, she said. He held up his hands to help her down. She put her hands on his shoulders and let him lift her from the wagon seat. He set her gently on the ground. For a brief moment, they stood close, his hands at her elbows, and she could see the long, thin scar that ran up his neck and disappeared into his hairline and an old shrapnel mark white against his sun-browned skin. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and something cleaner underneath. He stepped back exactly the right distance and turned to the others. Miss Sinclair, he said, I want you to meet my family. He introduced them one by one. Jonah nodded his hand, never leaving the air near his colt, his eyes assessing her without warmth and without hostility, just measuring. Ezra came forward and offered her his hand and said, Welcome, ma'am, with a voice that cracked twice in 3 words. Old Henry came last. The old man limped down from the porch, set his walking stick aside, and took both of Abby's hands in his. His remaining eye was the bluest thing she had ever seen. Welcome to the Lazy H, Miss Sinclair, he said. You came a long way to be here. We are going to do our best to make sure you do not regret it. Thank you, Mr. McCready. Henry, he said, just Henry. Mr. McCready was my father, and he was a worse man than I am, which is saying something. She laughed. She had not laughed in so long that the sound came out small and surprised, and she pressed her hand to her mouth as if to catch it. Old Henry's good eye crinkled at the corner. That is a good sound, he said. We will hear more of that around here, God willing. Nate carried her trunk up the porch steps. He showed her the room he had prepared for her on the 2nd floor. It was a simple room, a bed with a clean white quilt, a small dresser, a chair, a window that looked out across the valley. On the dresser stood a chipped clay pot holding a bunch of late wildflowers, blue and yellow and white, freshly picked. Nate stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Miss Sinclair, he said, I want to tell you something straight. We will be married in the church in town if you say yes, but I am not going to ask you to say yes today. I am not going to ask you to say yes this week. You take a month. You take longer if you need it. In the meanwhile, this room is yours. The door has a lock and a key. I and my brothers have all sworn on the Hollister name that you will be safe under this roof, and the Hollister name still means something in this valley. Do you understand me? I understand you, Mr. Hollister. Nate, he said quietly, if you can. Nate, he nodded. He stepped back and pulled the door almost closed behind him, then paused. Miss Sinclair, he added, there is one more thing I should tell you tonight, though I would rather not. There are men in this valley who want this land. They have been threatening us for some months. The threats are getting worse. I almost did not send for you because of it. But Henry told me a man without something to fight for is already half dead, and I think he is right. I want you to know what you are walking into. If at any point you decide it is too much, you say the word, and I will personally drive you back to Cheyenne and put you on a train and pay your way to anywhere you want to go. Do you understand that too? I understand. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he closed the door and his footsteps went back down the stairs. Abby stood alone in the small, clean room. She walked to the window. The sun was beginning to drop behind the Laramies, and the valley was filling up with long red light. Somewhere down by the barn, she could hear old Henry's voice and Toby's laugh and the soft snort of a horse. She thought about the Brennan Hotel kitchen at 4 in the morning. She thought about Murphy and his small wet eyes. She thought about Baltimore. Then she thought about a wilted yellow wildflower held out to her on a railway platform 2,000 miles from where she had been born. She knelt down beside the bed in her small clean room, and she folded her hands, and for the first time in 2 years, Abigail Sinclair prayed without bitterness. Down on the porch, old Henry McCready stood beside Nate in the long red dusk. The old man watched the upstairs window where the lamp had just been lit. He spoke without looking at the man beside him. "She is the one son. I knew it the second she stepped down from that wagon. Her eyes have seen sorrow, but the sorrow has not won. Do not let her go." Nate did not answer. He was looking at the window too. High on the eastern ridge, almost a mile away, a single rider sat his horse and watched the ranch through a long brass spyglass. He watched the wagon arrive. He watched the woman climb down. He watched the brown-hatted man take her hands. He watched the old one-eyed man embrace her. He watched the lamp go on in the upstairs window. The rider lowered his spyglass and turned in the saddle. Behind him, mostly hidden in the shadow of a cottonwood, sat a second man in a long black coat. The second man's face could not quite be seen. "She is here," the rider said. "The Hollister widower has himself a new bride. Pretty thing, too. East Coast by the look of her clothes." "Good," said the second man. His voice was very quiet and very calm. "Now they have something to lose. That changes everything. We start tonight. No, let them have a few weeks. Let her settle in. Let Hollister fall in love with her. Let all four of those brothers grow used to having a woman in the house. Then we begin. The deeper they have planted her in their hearts, the harder it will hurt them when we tear her out." The rider grinned. "Yes, sir, Mr. Crawford." Silas Crawford reined his horse around in the dusk. The two men rode east into the gathering dark. Behind them, in the window of a log ranch house in the valley below, the light of one small lamp burned steady against the coming night. The first 2 weeks at the Lazy H passed for Abby like a dream from which she was afraid to wake. Each morning she rose before the sun, dressed in the clean, simple clothes she had brought from Philadelphia, and went down to the kitchen to start the coffee. Each morning, old Henry was already there, his one blue eye watching the sunrise through the east window, his hands wrapped around a tin cup. Each morning he greeted her with the same words. "Morning, Miss Abby. The valley waited all night to meet you." She did not know what to say to that the first time. By the third morning, she was smiling when he said it. By the seventh morning, she was waiting for it. She and Nate moved around each other in those first weeks, like two careful animals learning the shape of a shared territory. He slept in the larger bedroom at the end of the upstairs hall. She slept in the smaller room overlooking the valley. The door between them stayed closed. Nate had told her on the porch the second night after the wedding at the small white church in Wolf Creek that their marriage would grow at whatever pace she chose. "I waited 3 years after Lenora," he had said. "I can wait longer." Lenora. That had been the name of his first wife. Abby learned more of the story from old Henry, not from Nate. Lenora had been a school teacher in Cheyenne, slender and dark-haired and quick to laugh, and she had died in the bedroom at the end of the hall in the winter of 1876 with the baby boy who had not lived long enough to be named. Abby had asked old Henry only once, and the old man had told her the story plainly, and then he had said something she did not forget. "Lenora was a fine woman, Miss Abby, but Lenora is the past. Nate needs someone for the present, someone for what comes next. You are that. You just do not know it yet." The wedding at the church had been short and quiet. Reverend Josiah Matthews had presided. Toby and Jonah and Ezra had stood as witnesses. Old Henry had sat in the front pew with his hat in his lap and his good eye shining. Sheriff Cyrus Briggs and his wife Hannah had been there from town. When Nate had slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, his hand had trembled. He had kissed her once briefly and respectfully, the way a man kisses a stranger he has just promised to honor. But Abby's heart had pounded so hard, she thought everyone in the church must hear it. Now, 2 weeks later, the band on her finger felt lighter than it had at the altar. She found herself touching it sometimes when she was alone, turning it slowly, getting used to the small, unfamiliar weight of it. The ranch house came back to life under her hands. She found the account books in a chaotic stack on the desk in the front room and spent 3 evenings putting them in order. She discovered that Nate had been carrying numbers in his head for 2 years because he hated putting pencil to paper and that the ranch was actually in better shape than the book suggested. She washed the curtains. She scrubbed the kitchen until it smelled like lye soap and clean wood. She baked bread on the second day, and the smell of it brought all four brothers and old Henry to the kitchen door at the same time like wolves drawn to a fire. On the third evening, she baked an apple pie from the fruit Toby had brought back from a tree behind the old Peterson place. When she set the pie on the table after supper, Nate stared at it for a long moment without moving. Then he picked up his fork and took a small bite. He chewed slowly. He set the fork down. "Lenora used to bake apple pie," he said. His voice was very quiet. "I have not eaten apple pie in 3 years." The kitchen went still. Toby looked at his plate. Ezra looked at his hands. Jonah did not move. Old Henry watched Nate the way a man watches a horse he is not sure of. Abby felt her face go hot. "I am sorry, Nate. I did not know. I would not have." He reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. The touch was brief, just 3 seconds, but the kitchen went stiller still. "No," he said. "You misunderstand me, Abigail. This is the best apple pie I have ever tasted. It just reminded me that life can still be sweet. I had nearly forgotten." He picked up his fork and finished the slice. The other men slowly began to eat again. But something in the kitchen had shifted, some small invisible thing, and Abby could feel old Henry's good eye on her with quiet approval. That night, lying alone in her small room, she pressed her hand against her chest where her heart was beating too fast and tried not to think about what was happening to her. Old Henry began teaching her to shoot the next morning. She had refused at first. "I am a Quaker Henry. My grandfather did not lift a hand against another man his whole life. Your grandfather lived in Pennsylvania," old Henry said. "This is Wyoming." He held out the small revolver, but first, "Out here refusing to defend your own people is not peace, Miss Abby. It is just letting wicked men do as they please. There is a difference." She took the revolver. It was heavier than she had expected. He showed her how to load it, how to hold it, how to brace her wrist against the kick. He walked her out behind the barn and set up 3 tin cans on a fence rail 20 paces away. The first time she fired, the recoil rocked her back on her heels and the bullet went somewhere into the prairie. The second time, the bullet hit the dirt 3 feet in front of the rail. The third time, she clipped the corner of the middle can. Old Henry grunted. "That is better than most men I trained at Cold Harbor." She spent an hour every morning that week behind the barn. By the end of 3 days, she could hit the cans cleanly at 20 paces. By the end of a week, she could hit them at 30. On the morning of the 8th day, Nate came around the corner of the barn just as she put 2 consecutive rounds through the center of the same can. He stopped and leaned against the fence and watched. When she lowered the revolver and saw him, her face went red. "You have been holding out on me," he said. "I did not want you to think I was. You thought I would think less of you for learning to defend yourself." His mouth pulled into a slow, careful smile, the first real smile she had seen from him. "Abigail Sinclair, you are the most unusual woman I have ever known." She looked away because she could not look at the smile. Old Henry, watching from the side, said nothing, but his good eye crinkled at the corner. That same night, very late, Abby was woken by a sound from the room at the end of the hall. A muffled cry, the kind of sound a man makes when he is fighting in his sleep. She lay still for a long moment listening. The cry came again, sharper, and then a thrashing, and then the unmistakable sound of someone speaking words she could not catch. She slipped out of her bed, pulled on her shawl, and stepped into the dark hallway. Toby was already there. He stood outside Nate's door with one hand half raised, as if he had been about to knock, and then thought better of it. He turned when he heard her and put a finger to his lips. "He has them most nights," he whispered. "Petersburg, the trenches. He never speaks of it in the day. Do not tell Ezra. The boy does not know how bad it gets." Inside the room, Nate said something that sounded like a name. Then he said it again louder, and there was a terrible, rough catch in his voice. Toby pressed his lips together and looked at the floor. "How long has this been going on?" Abby whispered. 15 years, Toby said. "Since the war. It got better when he married Lenora. It got worse after she died." He took a slow breath. "He would never want you to know. I will not say a word." Toby nodded once and slipped back to his own room. Abby stood in the dark hallway for a long time after he was gone. The cries from the room at the end of the hall slowly subsided into ragged breathing and then into silence. She went back to her bed, but she did not sleep for a long time. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man she barely knew who had been carrying ghosts for 15 years and had never once let them show in the daylight. The letter came 3 days later. It arrived with the regular Tuesday mail run from town, slipped in among the seed catalogs and the supply orders. Abby was sorting the mail at the kitchen table when she saw it. The envelope was thin and travel-stained. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, sloping, and old-fashioned. The postmark was Denver, Colorado. There was no return address. She opened it with the bread knife. Inside was a single small sheet of paper. 2 lines written in pencil. The writer told her that her father had not died the way she had been told. He warned her to be careful what lay beneath her feet. He told her that the men who had killed her father 2 years ago were now hunting her. She read the words 3 times. Then she sat down hard in the kitchen chair, the paper trembling in her hands. The bread knife slipped from her fingers and clattered on the floor. Her father had died in a mine collapse in Colorado in the summer of 1877. The company had sent her the official letter in a small envelope of his personal effects. She had buried his memory and gone to work paying off his debts. For 2 years she had grieved him. Now this. A stranger's hand telling her none of it had been true. She did not show the letter to Nate, not that day. She folded it and tucked it deep into the bottom of her trunk beneath her winter shawls. She told herself she needed time to think. But that night she could not sleep. At a little past midnight, she pulled on her shawl and went down the stairs in her stocking feet. The kitchen was lit by a single oil lamp on the long table. Nate was there alone, an old book open in front of him. It took her a moment to recognize what it was. A Bible. Lenora's Bible, she remembered old Henry saying once, the one she had brought west with her from Cheyenne. He looked up when she came in. "Trouble sleeping," he said. "A little." He closed the Bible carefully and gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. He poured her a tin cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. They drank in silence for a few moments. Then he started to talk. She did not ask him to. He just started the way a dam starts when the first stone gives way. He talked about the spring of 1864 when he was 17 years old and had lied to a recruiting officer about his age. He talked about the long, muddy march south. He talked about the wilderness, where he had seen a friend cut nearly in half by canister shot and had not had time to mourn him before the line moved forward. He talked about Petersburg, the long siege, the 10 months in the trenches, the rats, the smell, the constant low rumble of the guns. He talked about the morning a Confederate shell had exploded directly above the section of earthwork where he had been standing, and how the next thing he remembered was Henry McCready dragging him by the collar through a ditch full of mud and blood, the shrapnel still hot in his neck. He talked about how Henry had been a sergeant then, a hard, one-eyed sergeant with 2 grown sons of his own back home in Ohio. Henry had sat with him in the field hospital for 2 days while the surgeons decided whether to take his arm. The arm had been saved. Henry had said almost nothing the whole 2 days. He had just sat there. When the war ended a few months later, Henry had received word that both of his sons had been killed at Cold Harbor and that his wife had died of grief the following winter. The old sergeant had nothing left to go home to. So when Nate had ridden west in the spring of 1866 to start over, Henry had ridden with him, and Henry had never left. He told me on the trail one night, Nate said, he told me he had lost both his boys in that war. He told me he was going to call me his third one if I would let him. I have been letting him ever since. Abby reached across the table and took his hand. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say. Nate looked down at her small hand on his large one. Then he looked up at her face. His gray eyes were wet. She had not thought a man like Nate Hollister could have wet eyes. I told you I was not looking to replace Lenora, he said. That was the truth on the day I said it. I do not know what is true now, Abigail. I am sorry. I do not know what is true now. She squeezed his hand. Then she stood up slowly and went around the table and bent and kissed him very lightly on the top of his head. The way a woman kisses a man she is starting to love but is not ready to say so. Then she went back upstairs. She still did not show him the letter. The next morning, Ezra rode out with old Henry to bring the South herd in for the winter count. It was a routine ride. 2 men, 200 head of cattle, 3 hours of easy work. Old Henry had been doing it every fall for 10 years. They never made it to the South pasture. The shots came from a stand of cottonwoods near the creek. 4 men with rifles hidden in the low branches. The first volley dropped old Henry's horse out from under him. The second tore through the high crown of Ezra's hat and grazed his scalp. The boy went down in the long grass and lay still. Old Henry rolled clear of his dying horse, came up on one knee with his old Spencer carbine, and started shooting back. He was 66 years old, and he had one eye and a bad hip, but he had been a Union sergeant for 4 years, and his hands knew their work. He hit the first man in the throat. The man fell out of the cottonwood like a sack of grain. He hit the second man in the shoulder, and the man dropped his rifle. The other 2 opened up on him from cover. Old Henry took 1 round through the meat of his upper left arm and another that creased his ribs along the side, but he did not stop firing. He did not know if Ezra was dead or alive in the grass behind him, and he was not going to die until he was sure. Ezra was not dead. The boy lay flat in the long grass, his head ringing, blood running down the side of his face, and he could hear old Henry Spencer firing in steady, measured bursts. He could hear the other rifles firing back. He understood in a slow, distant way that Henry was buying him seconds. The boy reached for his own revolver. His fingers were clumsy. He had never drawn it in anger. He had never killed a man. He had never even pointed it at a person. A 5th man stepped out of the cottonwoods. This one walked like he was not afraid of Henry's carbine because Henry's carbine was running low. Ezra could see him plain. The man was raising his rifle to put a shot through old Henry's good eye. Ezra's hand closed around his revolver. He pulled it free of the holster. He raised it. His hand was shaking so badly he had to use his other hand to brace it. He thought of nothing. He just pulled the trigger. The 5th man went down sideways, surprised his rifle still raised. The 2 surviving attackers wavered. They had expected the boy to be dead. They had expected the old man to run out of ammunition. Instead, the old man kept firing, and now the boy was firing too. They broke. They wheeled their horses out of the cottonwoods and then rode hard for the ridge. Old Henry put 1 more round after them before his Spencer clicked empty. The valley went silent. Old Henry knelt in the grass with 1 hand pressed against the bleeding mess of his ribs and called out, Ezra, boy, can you hear me? I can hear you, Henry. Are you hit? A little. My head. Stay down. But Ezra was already crawling toward him through the grass. When he reached Henry, he saw the blood soaking through the old man's shirt, and he made a sound that was not quite a word. Henry, Henry, you are bleeding. A little more than a little, old Henry admitted. Then he looked the boy in the face, and his good eye was very steady. Ezra, look at me. You did right. You hear me. You did exactly right. He would have killed me. You did right. I shot him, Henry. I shot a man. I know you did, son, I know. Old Henry's voice was rough and gentle at the same time. It is going to live in you a long time, maybe forever. But you did it for me, and I am going to be alive at supper because of you, and you remember that part too. You remember both parts. Do not let one swallow the other. Then he passed out from the blood loss. Nate and Toby and Jonah found them an hour later. They had heard the shooting from the north pasture. They came at a hard gallop, three brothers riding low in the saddle, and when they saw the dead horse and the blood and the old man slumped in the grass with the boy crouched beside him, Nate's face went the color of bone. He swung off his horse before it had stopped moving. He gathered old Henry up in his arms like a child and carried him to where Toby was already laying out a saddle blanket. Jonah went to Ezra, took the boy by the shoulders, looked him over for wounds. The graze on Ezra's scalp was bleeding, but not deep. Jonah let out a breath that came from somewhere very deep in his chest. He pulled the boy hard against him for one fierce moment and then released him. They got old Henry back to the ranch house in the bed of the buckboard. Abby was already on the porch by the time they came up the lane. She had heard the wagon coming too fast and had known. She ran out into the yard barefoot. She saw Henry's pale face in the blood, and she did not waste time on questions. "Bring him to the kitchen table," she said. "Toby, get me hot water and clean linen. Jonah, get me the whiskey from the high shelf. Ezra, sit down right there, right there. Let me look at your head when I am done with Henry." She took charge the way a woman who has lost too much takes charge, cleanly and without panic. She had nursed her dying mother through scarlet fever at the age of 11. She had nursed her father through a broken leg at 15. She knew about wounds. She knew how to clean them and how to close them and how to keep a man from going into shock. She worked on old Henry for almost an hour. The bullet through his arm had gone clean through, and that one she packed with whiskey and clean linen and bound up tight. The crease along his ribs was uglier. It had not hit the bone, but it had bled long. She washed it and packed it and bound it. The whole time old Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, and the four brothers stood around the kitchen in a silent half circle watching. When she was done, she straightened up and pressed both hands against her lower back. She turned to Ezra. The boy was sitting in the chair by the door where she had told him to sit, his face the color of paper, his eyes staring at nothing. "Come here, Ezra," she said softly. He came. She washed the graze on his scalp and dressed it. It would heal in a week. She could feel him trembling under her hands. When she was done, she did not let go of him. She put her arms around him and pulled his head down against her shoulder, and she held him the way a mother holds a child who has just seen something he should not have seen. "Ezra," she whispered, "listen to me. You are all right. You are alive. You did what you had to do." "I killed him," the boy whispered against her shoulder. "I am going to hell." "No," she said, fierce and quiet. "You are not. You saved Henry. God knows the difference between killing and protecting. He knows, I know, and you will know too in time. But not tonight. Tonight you just let yourself feel it." He started to cry then, quietly with his face hidden against her shoulder. The first time he had cried since his mother died 8 years before. Abby held him and rocked him gently and looked over his blonde head at the kitchen doorway. Nate was standing there, watching her. His gray eyes were doing something she had never seen them do. In that moment, watching his wife hold his youngest brother and tell him he was not going to hell, Nathaniel Hollister knew with absolute certainty that he loved her. He knew it the way a man knows the sun is up. He did not say it. He did not move. He just stood there in the doorway and let it happen to him. 2 days later, Mortimer Pembroke came to the ranch. He arrived in a polished black buggy drawn by 2 matched gray horses. He wore a black wool suit, a white shirt with a high collar, and a watch chain of real gold across his vest. He was perhaps 50 years old, with thinning silver hair combed flat against his skull and small, precise hands. He looked entirely out of place in the dusty front yard of the Lazy 8. And he knew it, and he did not care. A man like Pembroke never rushed. He climbed down from the buggy, slowly brushed an invisible speck from his sleeve, and walked up the porch steps as if he were entering a courtroom. Nate met him on the porch. The other brothers were inside. Old Henry was upstairs sleeping under the dose of laudanum Abby had given him. Abby herself stood in the open kitchen doorway, just behind Nate, drying her hands on her apron. Mr. Hollister, Pembroke said. He removed his bowler hat. His voice was soft and educated. May I have the pleasure of a few moments of your time, and of your wife's if she would be so kind. The matter concerns her as much as it concerns you. Nate did not move out of the doorway. State your business right here, Mr. Pembroke. A pity. I was hoping for the comfort of your kitchen. Very well. Pembroke smiled the small, mannered smile of a man delivering a courtesy he did not feel. I represent Pacific Mining Consortium. I have come on behalf of my client to make you a final and very serious offer for the Lazy H Ranch and all its associated land and water rights. $75,000. The sum hung in the air. Toby, who had come up silently behind Abby in the doorway, made a small, involuntary sound in his throat. $75,000 was more money than the Lazy H would earn in 15 years. It was the kind of money that would buy a man a new life anywhere in the country. Nate did not blink. The land is not for sale. Mr. Hollister, Pembroke's voice softened further, became almost paternal. Please, I am not your enemy. I am simply a messenger. But hear what I am offering you. With this money, you and your brothers could move anywhere. California, Oregon, the fertile lands of the Willamette Valley. You could send your youngest brother, the one with the dream of becoming a veterinarian, to a proper college back east. Cornell University in New York has a fine program. He could study under doctors of the highest reputation. He could come home with letters after his name. The mention of Ezra was a surgical strike. Nate's jaw tightened. Pembroke saw it and pressed. And Mrs. Hollister. Pembroke turned his soft gaze to Abby. I imagine the life of a Wyoming ranch wife is rather different from what you grew up with in Philadelphia. With this money, you could live anywhere. You could have a proper house, servants, a life of dignity. You have already endured so much. 2 years of grief and labor in that city. Surely you have earned a softer chapter. Abby felt the trap close around her. Pembroke was very good. He had read her file. He knew exactly which strings to pull. For a brief instant, she could see California in her mind. She could see a white house with a porch and a small garden, and a quiet life with the man she had come to care for, far from rifles and bleeding old men and crying boys. The image was so bright and so close that she nearly reached for it. Then she looked at Nate. His face was carved from stone, but she saw the smallest tremor in his hand where it rested on the porch rail. He was waiting for her answer. He would not speak for her. He had never spoken for her. She took one step forward and placed her hand on top of his on the porch rail. Mr. Pembroke, she said. Her voice was very steady. I came to this valley with nothing. In the few weeks I have been here, I have been given more than I had in 2 years in Philadelphia. I have been given a roof, a name, a family, and the right to defend it. If I take your client's money today, then tomorrow your client does the same thing to another family, and then another, until this whole valley belongs to a man who has never set foot in it. I will not be the woman who let that happen. The answer is no, and I speak for the whole House of Hollister when I say it. A flicker crossed Pembroke's face. Surprise. He had expected Nate to be hard. He had not expected the woman to be harder. He recovered in a half-second, and the small, mannered smile returned. Mrs. Hollister, he said softly, you are a brave woman. I have noticed that bravery in this country very often does not last as long as the bones of the brave. He set his bowler hat back on his head. 4 Hollister brothers cannot guard one woman forever. Please give it some thought. He climbed back into his buggy. He clucked to the gray horses. The buggy turned in the yard and rolled away down the lane. Nate stood very still until it was out of sight. Then he turned to Abby. "You just turned down $75,000 from me," he said quietly. "I turned it down for us," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped close and lifted his hand and touched her cheek. The pad of his thumb traced the line of her cheekbone. It was the first time he had touched her face. She did not move. "Abigail," he said, his voice was very low, "I swore on the grave of Lenora that I would never love another woman. I cannot keep that vow. I have not been able to keep it for a week now. I love you. I do not know when it started. I think it started the day Toby brought you down off that wagon. I am telling you because I do not know how many days we have left, and I will not die without you having heard it from me." She did not answer with words. She lifted up onto her toes and she kissed him. Not the small, careful kiss of the wedding day. A real kiss, slow and deep, and certain the kiss of a woman who had also stopped being able to keep her own vows. When she came down off her toes, his arms were around her, and she could feel his heart beating hard through the front of his shirt. "I love you too, Nathaniel Hollister," she whispered against his chest. "God help me, I do." From the open kitchen doorway behind them, very softly, came the small, dry sound of old Henry McCready clearing his throat. He was leaning on the door frame in his nightshirt, pale as paper, one arm bandaged and the other braced against the wood. His good eye was bright. "You two go on," he said. "Do not mind the old man." The old man was just on his way to the kitchen for some water. The old man saw nothing. Then he smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had been waiting 15 years to see exactly this. The next morning, Abby was sorting through the old account books in the front room when she found the map. It was tucked between the pages of a leather-bound ledger from 1877. A single folded sheet of heavy paper yellowed at the creases marked with the precise pencil lines of a professional surveyor. Across the top of the page in neat block letters were the words that named the valley, identified the silver vein, estimated its value at $3 million, and credited the survey to A. Sinclair in 1877. At the bottom corner, the name of Pacific Mining Consortium was stamped in small confidential script. A. Sinclair, Augustus Sinclair, her father. Abby sat down very slowly on the floor of the front room with the map in her lap. The world tilted around her and then righted itself. Her father had walked this valley 2 years ago. Her father had stood on the very land she now lived on and had measured the ore beneath it. Her father had worked for the company that was now trying to kill her husband. She read the lines on the map again. $3 million in silver. Beneath her feet. She brought the map to Nate. He spread it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. Then he looked up at her. "Abigail, 2 years ago in the summer of 1877, a quiet man came to this ranch. He said he was a surveyor. He said he was making a geological study of the valley for an Eastern company. He stayed for 3 weeks. He was a kind man, soft-spoken. He helped Henry mend a fence one afternoon. Before he left, he gave me this leather ledger as a thank you for our hospitality. I have used it ever since for the accounts." He paused. His name was Augustus Sinclair. I never knew until this moment that he had a daughter. Abby pressed her hands flat against the table to keep them from shaking. "He was murdered," she said. "Or they tried. The letter I got, I did not show you. I should have. There is a letter in my trunk from Denver. Someone is telling me my father did not die in that mine collapse." Nate's face went very still. "Abigail, show me the letter." She brought it down. He read it twice. He folded it carefully and placed it on the table beside the map. Then he looked at her, and the look in his gray eyes was not the look of a husband. It was the look of a man who had been a soldier at 17. "They are coming for us," he said, "hard and soon. And not because of this land, because of what is under this land, and because your father knew." That night, the four Hollister brothers and Abby sat at the kitchen table and made plans. Old Henry sat with them, propped on cushions, his bandaged arm in a sling. They went over weapons and ammunition and the layout of the house. They picked windows. They picked angles. Toby would take the loft above the barn with the long Sharps rifle. Jonah would take the front of the house with his Colt and a Henry rifle. Ezra, against the protests of all his brothers, insisted on a position by the side window. "I am a man of this house," he said quietly. "I am not hiding in the cellar." They let him have the window because his face, when he said it was a face none of them had seen on him before. Nate would stand with Abby in the kitchen where the weakest line of approach lay. Old Henry would stay upstairs by the front bedroom window with the Spencer reloaded and propped against a chair. He could not stand long, but he could shoot sitting down, and he had been shooting sitting down for 60 years. They were finishing the plan when the first window of the front room exploded inward in a shower of glass. The night attack came without warning. 8 or 9 riders circling the house in the dark, firing and rolling volleys. Bullets tore through the walls. Splinters of wood flew across the kitchen. Nate hauled Abby down to the floor and covered her with his body for the first 3 seconds, then rolled off her, drew his Colt, and started returning fire through the kitchen window. Toby was already in the loft. They could hear the slow, heavy crack of the sharps from out in the dark. Jonah's Henry rifle was working in the front room, the quick metallic levering of a man who had been a peace officer for 2 years. Ezra's smaller Colt fired 3 times in quick succession from the side window, then a 4th time more slowly. Abby crawled to the kitchen window with her revolver in her hand. She did not have time to be afraid. She rose just enough to brace her wrist against the sill, and when a rider passed in the moonlight 20 paces from the house, she put 2 rounds at him, the way old Henry had taught her behind the barn. The rider's horse screamed and shied, and the rider went sideways out of the saddle into the dark. Upstairs, a steady, deep boom of old Henry's Spencer kept time with the others, slow and patient as a clock striking the hour. The fight lasted nearly an hour. The attackers tried to set fire to the barn with thrown torches. 2 of the torches caught, and the back wall of the barn began to burn. From the loft, Toby cursed and swung down the ladder and disappeared toward the smoke. He was not going to lose the horses. That was when old Henry came down the stairs. No one saw him until he was already at the back door. He was in his nightshirt with his trousers pulled on over it, and his boots and his gun belt buckled crooked over the nightshirt. The Spencer was in his good hand. His bandaged arm was useless. He looked at Nate across the kitchen, and his good eye was clear and calm. "I am going to help Toby with the horses," he said. "Henry, no, yes," he smiled. "The boys cannot lose the horses, son. 20 years of breeding stock in that barn." He stepped through the back door before Nate could stop him. He made it to the barn. He helped Toby cut the lead ropes and drive 5 of the panicked horses out the back door of the burning building. They saved every animal. As old Henry was turning back to push out the last mare, a single rifle shot cracked out of the dark from the ridge above the corral. The bullet took him high in the chest, just under the collarbone, and went clean through. Toby caught him before he hit the ground. Toby carried him into the house in his arms. He laid him on the long kitchen table where Abby had laid him only days before. There was so much blood that Abby knew the moment she saw it. She had nursed her dying mother. She knew the difference between a wound a body could survive and a wound a body could not. The brothers gathered around the table. Ezra was crying without making any sound. Jonah's hands were wet with his old friend's blood. Toby held one of Henry's hands in both of his. Nate knelt at the head of the table, his face very close to Henry's face. "Henry, we are sending Jonah for the doctor." "Hold on for me. Hold on." Old Henry's good eye opened. It was already going far away, but it found Nate, and it held there. "Nathaniel, listen. I am listening. I dragged you out of that ditch at Petersburg in 1865. You were 17 years old. You had been trying to die for 3 days. I told you then I would walk this earth with you until you found a reason to live. Until you found the reason." He drew a long, shallow breath. "I have been watching for 14 years. I saw it last week when she stopped your boy from breaking. I saw it yesterday when she put her hand on yours and turned down a fortune for you. You found it, son. The reason. She is the reason. Henry, please. My promise is kept, Nathaniel. I am released. I am going to go and find my old boys now. The ones I lost at Cold Harbor. I have been waiting a long time to see them. He turned his good eye toward Abby. The eye was already going far away. Girl, he said, I am sorry. I had your name a moment ago and I have lost it. The mind is going faster than the rest of me. It is Abigail, she said softly. She was holding his other hand. Tears were running down her face, but her voice was steady. Abigail. Yes, Abigail. You came a long way to be here. Do not let him forget what I told him about reasons. Promise, I promise. He looked at Ezra last. Boy, he said, you are a good man. Do not let one bad night swallow the good ones. Go and learn to be a doctor of the animals. Do it for me. I will, Henry. I swear it. Old Henry McCready closed his good eye. The hand Toby was holding loosened slowly, and then it was just a hand. The sound of his breathing did not stop all at once. It just got softer and softer until there was nothing more to hear. The kitchen of the Lazy H went absolutely silent. Outside, the last of the burning timbers and the penny wall of the barn collapsed with a soft hiss. The night wind moved through the broken kitchen window. Somewhere far off, an owl called once. Jonah laid his cheek against the dead man's hand. Toby pressed Henry's other hand to his forehead and his shoulders shook. Ezra slid down the wall to the floor and sat there with his arms around his knees and his face hidden. Nate did not move. He stayed kneeling at the head of the table with his hand on Henry's white hair. Abby went to her husband. She stood behind his kneeling form and put her arms around his shoulders and held him. He did not weep. He had not wept since 1865. But he let her hold him, and then he laid one rough hand over her hands where they rested across his chest. And after a long while he spoke without turning his head. They are going to pay for this, Abigail. We are going to make them pay, she said, together. And so the longest night of their lives began to bleed slowly toward dawn. The first gray light was just touching the eastern ridge when a stranger walked out of the tree line at the edge of the home pasture with both his hands raised in the air. He was an older man, thin with the leanness of a man who had been hungry for a long time. He wore the patched canvas clothes of a miner. His hair and beard were gray and unkempt. He walked slowly, carefully across the open ground toward the house his hands held, high as he could hold them, calling out as he came, "Hello, the house. Hello, the house. Do not shoot. I am not armed. Do not shoot. I am looking for my daughter. I am looking for Abigail." Abby was standing at the broken kitchen window with the second pot of coffee she had made that night. She heard the voice and she went absolutely still. The pot fell from her hands and shattered on the floor. She walked out the front door and down the porch steps and into the cold gray dawn in her bare feet. The thin man saw her coming. He stopped in the middle of the yard with his hand still raised. His face crumpled. "Abigail, daughter, oh sweet God in heaven, Abigail. It is your father, it is Augustus. I am alive, my girl. I am alive." She stopped 10 feet away from him in the wet grass. She was shaking from her hair to her bare toes. Behind her on the porch, Nate had come out with his Colt drawn. Toby was behind Nate. Jonah was behind Toby. The three brothers stood in a silent line in the doorway and watched. Abby stared at the gray-bearded man standing in her yard, the man who had been dead for 2 years, the man whose debts had ruined her life, the man whose name was on the silver map in her kitchen. She did not know whether to run to him or run from him. Her hand went up slowly to her mouth. "Father," she whispered. The word came out broken. Augustus Sinclair took one careful step toward her, then another. "Abigail," he said, "I owe you everything. I owe you the truth. I have come a very long way to give it to you." The sun came up over the eastern ridge. Its first long red light fell across the yard and across the broken windows of the ranch house and across the smoking ruin of the back wall of the barn and across the white sheet that covered the body on the kitchen table inside. A dead old soldier, a risen dead father, a silver map worth $3 million. a mining company that would not stop, and a woman from Philadelphia who had become the center of all of it. The morning light came up slow and red over Wolf Creek Valley. It found a yard full of broken glass and a barn with a smoking wall, and four men and a woman standing very still in the wet grass looking at the gray-bearded ghost of Augustus Sinclair. For a long time, no one moved. Then Abby took one step forward, then another. Then she crossed the last few feet of cold ground in a half run and stopped just short of him, with her hands held up between them like a shield. "Do not touch me," she said. Her voice was very small. "Do not touch me yet." Augustus Sinclair lowered his raised hands slowly to his sides. He was a thin man, thinner than she remembered, with the prairie sun burned into the lines of his face. His gray beard was uneven, cut with a knife instead of a razor. His eyes were the same eyes she had grown up with, hazel with little green flecks near the center. They were full of tears. "I will not," he said. "I will not lay a finger on you until you say so. I will stand here all day if I have to." "You are dead," she whispered. "They sent me a letter. They sent me your watch. They sent me a lock of your hair in an envelope. I buried you, Father. I buried you in my heart. Do you understand what you did to me?" "I understand," he said. He was crying openly now, not making any sound. Just the slow, steady tears of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "I understand, Abigail. I understand all of it. I am here to answer for every day of it." She did not answer. She stood there in her bare feet in the wet grass with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at her dead father, and she felt nothing she could put a name to. Joy and rage and grief and disbelief all moved through her at once, and none of them could find a way out. Behind her on the porch, Nate slowly lowered his Colt. He looked at Toby. Toby looked at Jonah. Jonah looked at the gray-bearded stranger in the yard, then at the dead man on the kitchen table behind them, then back at the stranger. Jonah was the one who finally spoke. "Mister," he said. His voice was flat. "I do not know who you are or what you have come for, and right now I am not in a charitable mood. There is a man on a table in our kitchen who was alive yesterday, and your daughter is the only reason I am not putting you on the ground. You walk slow, you keep your hands where I can see them, and you tell us your business inside where we can hear you proper." Augustus nodded once. He raised his hands again, palms out, and walked slowly toward the porch. As he passed Abby, she did not turn her head, but after he had gone 3 steps, she reached out without looking, and her fingers brushed the sleeve of his patched canvas coat. Just for 1 second. Then her hand fell away. He felt it. His shoulders shook for one breath. He kept walking. They sat him at the long kitchen table. Old Henry's body lay beneath a clean white sheet at the far end. Augustus Sinclair did not look at the sheet. He could not look at the sheet. Abby brought him a tin cup of coffee with hands that did not quite stop trembling, and she set it in front of him without speaking, and she sat down across from him beside Nate. Toby leaned against the wall by the window. Jonah stood with his back to the cold stove and his arms crossed over his chest. Ezra sat in the corner with his knees drawn up and his bandaged head against the wall, watching with red-rimmed eyes. "Talk," Nate said. Augustus wrapped his hands around the tin cup as if to warm them, though the coffee was scalding. In the spring of 1877, he began, "I was hired by the Pacific Mining Consortium out of San Francisco. They wanted a quiet survey of 3 valleys in the southern Wyoming Territory. Wolf Creek was one of them. I am not a young man, but I was once a good geologist and I needed the work. My wife had been dead a long time, and my Abigail was studying to be a teacher in Philadelphia. The pay was very good. I did not ask too many questions about why the survey had to be quiet." He paused. He looked across the table at Nate. "I came to this ranch in July of that year. You let me sleep in the bunkhouse for 3 weeks. You and Mr. McCruddy helped me mend a fence one afternoon when my horse threw a shoe. You gave me supper at this table for 21 nights and never asked me for $1. I remember every meal. I remember you," Nate said quietly. "I walked every acre of your land. I walked the Brennan place. I walked the Peterson place. I walked the 4 other ranches in this valley. And what I found beneath your feet, Mr. Hollister, was a silver vein, the like of which has not been found in this territory in 20 years. $3 million at the very least. Possibly 5. He took a long, shaky breath. I went back to San Francisco in August with my notebooks full. I sat down at a long, polished table in a long, polished office, and I gave my report to a man named Edmund Vance. The brothers exchanged a look. The name had been spoken in the kitchen for the first time. Vance is the owner of Pacific Mining Consortium. He is a very wealthy man. He is also the most cold-hearted man I have ever sat across a table from. He listened to my report. He looked at my maps. Then he asked me one question. He asked me how many families currently lived on the land above the vein. I told him there were 6 ranches, 27 men, women, and children altogether. He said that was unfortunate, but not insurmountable. He said his people would handle the relocation. Those were his exact words. The relocation. Augustus's hands tightened around the tin cup. I was not a brave man, Mr. Hollister, but I was not a stupid one either. I had seen what Pacific Mining did to homesteaders in Colorado the year before. I knew what relocation meant in Mr. Vance's mouth. So that night in my hotel room in San Francisco, I made a copy of the map by hand. I wrote your name on it because the strongest part of the vein lay beneath this house. And before I left San Francisco, I slipped that copy into the pages of a leather ledger I had bought as a gift. I mailed it to you with a short note thanking you for your hospitality. I prayed you would never have reason to find what was inside. I prayed Pacific Mining would lose interest. I prayed wrong. He paused. He looked at Abby. When I got back to my own boarding house in Denver, 3 of Vance's men were waiting for me. They told me my services were no longer needed. They told me my notebooks were the property of the company. They told me I was to come with them. I knew then that I was going to be relocated too. I was lucky, or I was guided, I do not know which. I had a friend named Calvin Whitfield from my younger days, a freight man who ran wagons between Denver and the mining camps. Calvin owed me a debt from 20 years before and was the kind of man who paid his debts. I went to him that same night. I told him everything. We staged it together. There was a small mine collapse north of Leadville 2 days later, a real one with 3 real bodies the company never identified. Calvin told the company that he had pulled my body from the rubble. He sent them my watch. He cut a lock of my hair and put it in an envelope. He told the company I was dead, and the company believed him because the company wanted to believe him. They had no more reason to look for me. But Calvin betrayed me too in a smaller way. I had given him $500 before I disappeared and asked him to send it on to my Abigail in Philadelphia in small amounts with a letter saying her father had wished it sent. I thought it would help her with the debts. Calvin kept the money. He told me when I next saw him 2 months later that he had sent it. He told me Abigail had used it and was doing well. I believed him. I had to believe him. I could not contact her myself without risking her life. And so for 2 years, I lived in a shack in the Wyoming high country and trapped beaver and ate beans, and I told myself my daughter was safe and provided for in Philadelphia. He stopped. He stared down into his coffee. 3 weeks ago, I came down to a trading post for supplies. I picked up an old newspaper to read by the fire that night. There was a wedding announcement on the second page. A mail-order bride from Philadelphia had married a rancher in Wolf Creek. He looked up at her. The names were yours and Mr. Hollister's. I read them 3 times. I thought it could not be. Then I knew it was. My daughter, who I had believed safe in Philadelphia, was in fact standing on $3 million of Pacific Mining silver and married to the one rancher in this valley Edmund Vance had been trying to break for 6 months. I left for Wolf Creek that night. I rode by way of Cheyenne. I did not dare announce myself. I followed Crawford and his men 3 nights ago and learned where they meant to strike. I rode hard yesterday and last night to get here in time to warn you. His voice broke for the first time. I did not get here in time. I am sorry. I am so sorry about your friend on the table. I will carry that the rest of my days. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a meadowlark sang one bright note from the long grass and then went still as if even the bird understood it had spoken at the wrong moment. Abby looked at her father for a long time. When she spoke at last, her voice was not soft. You let me think you were dead for 2 years, Father. You let me work 3 bars. You let me bleed into a wash bucket at 4 in the morning for a man who threatened to sell me to Baltimore. All so I would be safe. She drew a breath. I do not forgive that today. Maybe I will not forgive it next week. But I am not going to lose you twice, so you will stay. You will stay in this house and you will earn your way back to me a day at a time. Do you understand me? Yes, daughter. Then drink your coffee, she said. We have work to do. She got up from the table without looking at him, and she walked over to where old Henry McCready lay beneath his white sheet, and she laid her hand briefly on the place where his shoulder was, and she bowed her head. The brothers watched her in silence. Augustus Sinclair watched her with a kind of broken wonder. They buried old Henry the next morning on the rise above the cottonwoods where a man could see the whole sweep of Wolf Creek Valley laid out below him. The whole town came. Reverend Josiah Matthews stood at the graveside in his black coat and read from a small worn Bible. His voice was steady. The wind off the Laramie Mountains tugged at his sleeves. Henry McCready was not a saint, the Reverend said. He was a man who fought for his country in the war between the states, a man who lost his own 2 boys at Cold Harbor and chose to make a third son out of a half-dead 17-year-old he dragged out of a ditch at Petersburg. A man who rode west with that boy and never asked for anything in return except a place at his table and a horse to ride. A man who last night ran into a burning barn at 66 years of age to save 5 horses he loved because a younger brother of his loved them more. That is the kind of man we are putting in this ground today. That is the kind of man we should all be trying to become. Amen. Amen, said the small crowd. Nate stood at the head of the grave with his hat in his hand. He did not speak. He had not spoken much since the night before. Abby stood beside him, her hand wrapped tight around his, her eyes dry. She had cried herself out at 3 in the morning in their kitchen, and now she had no tears left, only a hard, cold thing in her chest that she recognized as resolve. Toby and Jonah and Ezra lowered the coffin together. When the first shovel of dirt fell on the wood, Ezra made a small sound and turned his face into Tobi's shoulder. Toby put one arm around the boy and held him without saying anything. Augustus Sinclair stood at the back of the small crowd. He did not approach the grave. He did not feel he had earned the right. When it was done, the people of Wolf Creek came up one by one and shook Nate's hand and said the small, useless things that people say. Sheriff Cyrus Briggs was the last. He was a heavy-set man of 50 with iron-gray hair and very tired blue eyes. He had been the sheriff of Wolf Creek for 11 years, and he had ridden as a cavalry corporal in the war. He took Nate's hand in both of his own. Nate, he said, I knew Henry for 10 years. He was a good man, and what was done to him last night was murder plain and clean. I want you to know I have wired the territorial marshal in Cheyenne this morning. I do not have the men to fight Pacific Mining alone, but I am not going to look the other way. You give me what you have got, and I will move on it. I swear that to you on Henry's grave, Cyrus, Nate said. He held the sheriff's gaze a long moment. I am going to take you at your word. I have always taken you at your word. Come to the ranch tomorrow morning. I will tell you everything I know. I will be there. The sheriff tipped his hat to Abby and to Augustus, standing at the back, and to the brothers, and he walked slowly down the slope to where his horse was tied. That afternoon, they sat in the front room of the ranch house and made the plan that would either save them or kill them all. Augustus spread his original survey notes on the table beside the map Abby had found in the ledger. He pointed to small markings only a geologist would understand. He confirmed what Nate already feared. The richest part of the silver vein lay directly beneath the foundations of the Lazy H Ranch house itself. There was no compromise possible. Pacific Mining did not want most of the valley. They wanted this house. They wanted this kitchen. They wanted the very ground Henry McCready was buried in. Edmund Vance lives in San Francisco, Augustus said. He almost never travels. He has a long, polished office on the third floor of the Montgomery block on Montgomery Street. He has a wife and two grown daughters who do not know what he does. He gives money to the opera. He is considered a respectable man. He will not be considered a respectable man by the time we are done with him, Abby said. We need three things, Toby said. We need solid evidence. We need a way to get that evidence past the corrupt judges in this territory and into the hands of someone Vance does not own. And we need to live long enough to do both. The evidence is in Mortimer Pembroke's office in Wolf Creek, Augustus said. I am as sure of that as I am of my own name. Pembroke is too careful and too proud to destroy his own paper. He keeps a safe in the back room of his law office. Vance writes him letters. Vance has been writing him letters about my own death, and about the Petersons, and about the Brennans, and now about all of you. Those letters are in that safe. Jonah uncrossed his arms. I will get into that safe. Nate looked at his brother. Jonah, you know what you are saying. I was a peace officer in Dodge City for 2 years, Jonah said. I learned how to open a door without a key. I learned how to walk through an empty room and leave it the way I found it. I have not used those skills in 3 years. They have not gone away. He paused. I will go alone. You will not, Abby said. Ma'am, you will not, Jonah. I am the bookkeeper of this family. I am the only one in this room who can read a ledger fast enough to tell us in 5 minutes whether what we have found is worth the risk of dying for. You can open the safe. I will read what is inside. Nate, tell her. Nate looked at Abby. He looked at Jonah. He looked back at Abby. His jaw worked once. I cannot tell her anything, Jonah. She made me swear when I married her that she would fight beside me, not behind me. I am not going to break that promise to her 3 weeks in. He turned to Abby. But you take Jonah's pistol and you put it in your dress and you do not go anywhere in that office without him at your side. Do you understand me, Abigail? I understand. Then go tomorrow night. Take Catherine Doyle into your confidence first. She has been waiting 2 years for evidence on Pacific Mining. She will print whatever you bring her. Get the paper to press before the sun comes up the next morning. After that, the truth is a thing no one can shoot. The plan was set. They spent the rest of the day cleaning weapons and counting cartridges and making a quiet inventory of everything they had. Augustus turned out to be a fair hand at carpentry. He helped Toby board up the broken windows of the front room with planks from the woodshed. Ezra helped his father dig 2 long, shallow trenches behind the house, the kind a man could lie in with a rifle. Nate spent an hour alone at the grave on the rise, his hat in his hands, talking quietly to the ground. That same evening, after the others had gone to clean their weapons, Ezra found Nate alone behind the barn. Nate, I want a place in the line tomorrow. A real one. Not the side window because it is the safest. Wherever you would put a grown man. Nate looked at his youngest brother for a long moment. The boy who used to read books on the porch was standing in front of him with a Colt on his hip and a steady look in his eye that had not been there a month ago. Ezra, you shot a man 5 days ago. Some men would still be in bed. I am not in bed. I am standing here, he paused. Henry told me on the grass that day not to let one bad night swallow the good ones. I am trying, but part of trying is not hiding. Put me where you would put Toby if Toby were 19. Nate laid his hand on his brother's shoulder. Side window then, but you take the Henry rifle, not the Colt. And you do not leave that window for any reason until I come and get you. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Then welcome to the line, brother. When Nate came back down from the rise above the cottonwoods where he had lingered another quarter hour at Henry's grave, he found Abby waiting for him on the porch. Walk with me, she said. They walked together along the creek. The cottonwoods had shed most of their yellow leaves. The water ran clear and cold over the round stones. Neither of them spoke for a long time. If something happens to me tomorrow night, Abby said at last, I want you to know that I do not regret coming here. I do not regret 1 minute of it. Not the night they shot through our windows. Not Henry, not even the letter that was waiting for me in Philadelphia about my father. I would do all of it again. Abigail, let me finish. I want you to know I love you, Nathaniel Hollister. I love your three brothers like they are my own blood. I loved Henry more than I have loved any old man since my own grandfather died. Yeah. And whatever happens tomorrow night, I want my last words to you to be the true ones, not some careful nothing said over breakfast. He stopped walking. He turned her gently by the shoulders to face him. The autumn light was on her hair, and her eyes were very clear. You are not going to die tomorrow night, he said. I am going to walk you to the edge of Wolf Creek myself in the dark, and I am going to wait outside that town with a long rifle, and if anyone comes out of the door of Pembroke's law office, that is not you and Jonah. That man is not going to take 10 more steps. Do you understand me? I understand you. He took her face in his calloused hands and he kissed her there beside the cold creek slowly and carefully, and for a long time, and the cottonwoods dropped their last few leaves around them in the silence. Catherine Doyle was a small, sharp-eyed woman of 40 with iron in her hair and ink stains on her fingers. She owned the Wyoming Sentinel outright, having inherited it from her late husband, and she had been waiting for this story for 2 years. When Abby and Jonah walked into her office at sundown the next evening and laid the situation out in 20 quick sentences, Catherine listened without interrupting. When they were finished, she stood up from her desk, walked to the front door of her newspaper office, locked it, and pulled the shades. I have 2 compositors I trust with my life, she said. I am sending one of them home tonight on a story about cattle prices, so he is out of the building. The other is named Ben Holcomb, and he was at Antietam. He will set type all night for this. I want everything you bring back from Pembroke's office in my hands by 4 in the morning. I will have a special edition on the street by 7. Telegraph copies will be on the wires to Cheyenne, Denver, San Francisco, and Chicago by 8. By noon tomorrow, Edmund Vance will be the most hated man west of the Mississippi. Bless you, Catherine Abbey said. Bless yourself, child. You are the one going through that office window tonight. Now sit down and let me draw you both a map of the building. I have been inside it twice. The safe is in the back room behind a portrait of Pembroke's late wife. He thinks no one knows that. I happen to know it because his late wife was my second cousin, and she told me about the safe at her own Christmas dinner 6 years before she died. God rest her tired soul. Abby almost laughed. She had not expected to be able to almost laugh in a moment like that. They went out the back of the newspaper building into the dusk. The streets of Wolf Creek were nearly empty. A piano was tinkling in one of the saloons down the way. A dog barked once and was hushed. Jonah moved like a man who had walked these streets 100 times in the dark, which he had. Abby walked half a step behind him, her hand resting on the small revolver tucked into the deep pocket of her dress. Pembroke's law office was a narrow 2-story brick building wedged between the bank and a dry goods store. Jonah took them down the alley behind it. He stopped beneath a small, high window. He looked up at it, then at Abby, then back at the window. I will lift you, he said. She nodded. He laced his hands together. She put her foot in them. He lifted her up to the window with no more effort than if she had been a child. The window was unlatched. She slid it open and pulled herself through onto a bookshelf inside, then dropped lightly to the floor of a dark hallway. A moment later, Jonah was through the window after her. He moved like a shadow. The back room was at the end of the hall. The portrait of Pembroke's late wife hung on the wall opposite a heavy oak desk. Behind the portrait, set into the brick, was a small black iron safe with a 4-wheel combination dial. Jonah knelt in front of it. He pulled a small, folded leather case from his coat. From the case, he took a stethoscope. He fitted the earpieces into his ears and placed the bell against the door of the safe near the dial. Where did you get a stethoscope? Abby whispered. A doctor in Dodge City lost it to me at poker in 1875. Jonah whispered back. He never asked for it back. I believe he was glad to be rid of it. He turned the dial slowly. His fingers were very steady. Abby stood behind him and watched the door of the room. Her breathing had gone shallow, and her heart was a small, fast drum in her chest. She listened to the silence of the building. She listened for footsteps. She listened for the front door. It took Jonah 11 minutes. She knew because the small clock on Pembroke's desk ticked loud in the silence, and she had counted every tick. The fourth wheel fell with a small, soft click. Jonah took the stethoscope from his ears. He pulled the heavy door open. The safe was full of paper. Abby went down on her knees beside him and pulled the papers out in handfuls. She spread them on the floor. There was a kerosene lantern on the desk above them. Jonah reached up and turned the wick down low and slid the lantern to the edge of the desk where it threw just enough light to read by. She read fast. She had been a clerk and a bookkeeper for 2 years. Her eyes knew how to find names and dates and dollar amounts in the body of a document. The first letter she read was dated August of 1877 and was signed by Edmund Vance. It instructed Mortimer Pembroke to ensure that the geologist Augustus Sinclair did not return to Denver alive. Abby's hand shook so badly she dropped the page. She picked it up and laid it carefully aside on a separate pile. The second letter, dated 3 months later, instructed Pembroke to begin pressuring the Peterson family to sell. The third letter, dated 6 months after that, expressed satisfaction that the killing of the Brennan dog had been sufficient to convey the message. The fourth letter, dated only 3 weeks ago, named Nathaniel Hollister specifically. It said Hollister was the keystone. It said that once Hollister broke, the others would follow within the month. It said the sudden marriage of Hollister to a woman from the East was an unexpected complication that should be turned into an advantage. It said the woman could be used. Abby read the last sentence twice. Her face went very white. She set the letter on the pile. There were ledgers as well. 3 of them bound in red leather. They were the private accounts of Pacific Mining Consortium for the Wolf Creek operation. Abby flipped through them. She saw payments to Silas Crawford. She saw payments to 2 men whose names she did not recognize but suspected Catherine Doyle would. She saw a payment of $600 dated 3 months ago to a man named Calvin Whitfield in Denver, with a notation referring to services rendered in the matter of the geologist. Calvin Whitfield, her father's old friend, the freight man, the man who had taken her father's $500 and lied to him about sending it on to Philadelphia. Calvin Whitfield had been on Pacific Mining's payroll the entire time. Calvin had not betrayed Augustus out of greed alone. He had betrayed him for Vance. She made a small sound through her teeth. Jonah looked at her sharply. What is it? A man who is going to answer for what he did, she said. Later, she closed the ledger. We have what we came for. Take everything. They were stuffing the papers into the canvas bag Jonah had brought when they heard the front door of the office unlock. Both of them froze. Footsteps in the front room. 2 sets, then a third. Then a man's voice, soft and educated, that Abby recognized at once. I am telling you, Crawford, the woman has been to the newspaper. I had it from my own clerk an hour ago. He saw her go in. We need to clean out the safe tonight and burn anything that Pembroke stopped speaking. The lantern on the desk was still lit, turned low. Pembroke would see the light under the door of the back room within 3 seconds. Jonah moved without sound. He grabbed the canvas bag in one hand and Abby's wrist in the other and pulled her behind the desk just as the door of the back room swung open. The lantern light fell across the carpet. Mortimer Pembroke stood in the doorway. Behind him stood Silas Crawford with a pistol already drawn. Behind Crawford stood a third man Abby did not know. Pembroke saw the open safe. He saw the empty shelves. His face went a color Abby had never seen on a man before. Gray, like wet ash. Out, he said softly, whoever you are, out from behind that desk now. Jonah moved. He came up over the top of the desk in one motion, his Colt in his hand, and he fired 3 times before Pembroke had even raised his arms. The first round took Crawford in the right shoulder and spun him into the doorframe, his pistol falling to the floor. The second round took the third man in the leg and dropped him. The third round went into the ceiling above Pembroke's head as a deliberate warning. Pembroke screamed and threw himself flat on the carpet. Window, Jonah said. Abby was already running for it. She pulled herself up and through with the canvas bag clutched against her chest. Jonah came through behind her with the speed of a man who had practiced the move once already that night in his head. They dropped into the alley. They ran. Behind them, Crawford was already shouting from the office, and there were boots on the boardwalk somewhere out front. They cut left through a horse lot, jumped a low fence, and came out 2 streets over near the back of the Wyoming Sentinel building. Abby pounded twice on the back door with the heel of her hand. Catherine Doyle opened it from the inside. Get in, get in. They went in. Catherine slammed the door and threw the bolt. Abby dropped the canvas bag on a long, inking table. Everything she said. Take everything, print all of it. Names, dates, dollar amounts. The letter where Vance ordered my father killed. Print that one first. Print it on the front page above the masthead. Print my father's name in letters 2 inches high. Catherine Doyle smiled. It was a dangerous, beautiful smile. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for this night for 2 years. Mr. Holcomb, she called over her shoulder, set tight, we have a paper to make. A man's voice from the back called back, yes, ma'am. Abby and Jonah did not stay. They had to be out of Wolf Creek before sunrise. Catherine pressed a wrapped sandwich into Abby's hand and a pistol into Jonah's and shoved them out the back door into the alley. Behind them, the printing press began to clatter into life in the dark. They were halfway back to the ranch, their horses moving at a hard trot through the cold pre-dawn when Jonah suddenly reined in. His head went up like a hunting dog's. What is it? Listen. She listened. At first there was nothing. Then she heard it. A long, low rumble far away to the south, the sound of many hooves moving fast over hard ground. A lot of riders. Coming from the direction of Cheyenne. How many, she whispered. 12, maybe more. He paused. They are coming for the ranch. They rode the rest of the way at a flat run. The sun was just beginning to throw its first gray light onto the eastern ridge as they came over the rise above the Lazy H. Below them, the ranch house stood quiet. Smoke rose thin from the kitchen chimney. Nate was on the porch with his rifle across his arms. He had been waiting all night. He saw them come over the rise, and his shoulders dropped half an inch in relief. And then he saw the look on Abby's face as she rode in, and his shoulders came right back up. Riders, Jonah called as he swung down from his horse. 12 at least, probably more. 20 minutes out. From the south. Toby was already running for the barn. Ezra came out of the house with his Henry rifle in his hands and his face very pale and very calm. Augustus Sinclair came out behind him with one of old Henry's old Spencer carbines in his hands. Cyrus Nate said, "Did you ride past the sheriff's office?" "We did not," Abby said. "Catherine sent a boy 10 minutes before we left town to wake him. Then we trust him." Nate turned to the others. "Take your places, same as we drilled. Toby the loft, Jonah the front room, Ezra side a window with the Henry. Augustus, take the upstairs window where Henry stood. Abigail, the kitchen with me. Move." They moved. The riders came over the south rise 12 minutes later. There were 16 of them. They were not the loose collection of saddle tramps Crawford had been using. These were professional men dressed in dark coats and dark hats riding in 2 columns. Each man carried a rifle. They came on at a measured trot, not a charge the way a body of cavalry comes on when it knows it has the advantage of numbers. Silas Crawford was at the head of the column, his right shoulder bandaged where Jonah had shot him in the night, his face dark with anger and pain. But they were not alone in the valley. From the eastern ridge, just as the killers came within rifle range of the ranch house, a single bugle note sounded. It was not a Union Army bugle. It was the smaller, sharper call of a county posse horn. 16 heads turned as one. On the eastern ridge, lined out against the morning sky, were 11 men on horses. At their head, his iron-gray hair blowing in the wind, sat Sheriff Cyrus Briggs of Wolf Creek. Beside him sat 2 of his deputies. Behind him sat 8 men Abby recognized from the funeral the morning before. Tobias Brennan was one of them. 3 of the others were ranchers from the lower valley whose names she did not yet know. 2 more were the saloon keepers of Wolf Creek who had locked their doors and grabbed their shotguns at 4 in the morning when Catherine Doyle's boy came pounding on every front door in town with a copy of the special edition fresh off the press. Cyrus Briggs raised his rifle above his head. Then he brought it down. The 11 men of the Wolf Creek posse came down the eastern slope at a hard gallop, screaming. What followed was not a battle so much as a vice closing. The Pacific mining killers were caught between the rifles of the Hollister ranch house in front of them and the charge of the Wolf Creek posse coming in behind them on the open ground. They tried to wheel into a defensive ring. They had no time. Toby fired from the loft with the sharps, and the lead rider on the left flank went out of his saddle. Jonah's Henry rifle barked from the front room, and another man dropped. Augustus Sinclair, whose hands had not held a weapon in 2 years, but who had once been a Union artilleryman, calmly worked the lever of old Henry Spencer from the upstairs window and put 2 men on the ground in 3 shots. Ezra fired 3 times from the side window with his Henry rifle, and only one of his bullets found a man, but the man it found was the one who had set the fire in the barn the night before, and Ezra would later say that one was for Henry. In the kitchen, Abby fired her revolver at a rider who came around the corner of the woodshed at the head of 3 others. She missed him with her first shot and clipped his horse with her second, and the horse stumbled and threw him. Nate shot the rider while he was still trying to get up and shot the next 2 as they came on. He did not waste a round. Silas Crawford saw the trap. He saw his men breaking. He understood in a single black instant that the entire situation had collapsed. He turned his horse out of the formation alone and spurred it straight for the ranch house, straight for Nate. Nate stepped down off the porch with his Colt in his hand. He stepped out into the open of the yard. He did not say anything. He walked 4 paces forward and stopped and waited. Crawford rode at him. Crawford raised his pistol. At 15 yards, Crawford fired and the bullet went past Nate's left ear. At 10 yards, Crawford fired again, and the bullet plucked at the sleeve of Nate's coat. At 5 yards, Nate raised his Colt, slow and easy the way old Henry McCready had taught him to raise a sidearm 14 years before in the trenches outside Petersburg, and put 1 round through the center of Silas Crawford's chest. Crawford went sideways out of the saddle. His horse ran past Nate without slowing and disappeared around the side of the house. Crawford lay in the dust on his back. He was still breathing. Nate walked to him and stood over him and looked down into his face. "That one was for Henry," Nate said. Then he turned away and Silas Crawford was dead before Nate had taken 3 steps. The rest was over in another 4 minutes. 9 of the killers had been shot down. 5 threw down their rifles and raised their hands. 2 more tried to ride for the South Ridge and were run down by Sheriff Briggs and a deputy. By the time the morning sun fully cleared the eastern ridge and lit the whole valley gold, the yard of the Lazy H was full of disarmed men in dark coats kneeling in the dust with their hands behind their heads and Wolf Creek deputies tying their wrists. Toby came down from the loft. Jonah came out from the front room. Ezra came out from the side window with his Henry rifle still in his hand and a strange quiet look on his face. Augustus Sinclair came down the stairs slow, leaning heavily on the banister, the old Spencer carbine cradled across his chest. He had not been touched. Abby came out of the kitchen and went straight to Nate and put her arms around him and held on. He was warm and alive and breathing and real, and she did not say a word for a long time. He bent his head and pressed his face against her hair. Cyrus Briggs walked his horse up to the porch. He was bleeding from a graze along his cheek, but he was smiling. He pulled a folded newspaper from inside his coat. The ink was still fresh. "Catherine Doyle's special edition," he said, "hot off the press. They were handing them out on the boardwalk at 6 this morning. Mr. Hollister, Mrs. Hollister, the 3 of you have just brought down Pacific Mining Consortium." He tossed the paper up onto the porch. The headline was as big as Catherine had promised, 2 inches high. It said that Pacific Mining had ordered the murder of a geologist and had threatened the families of Wolf Creek Valley, and that the evidence was now in hand. Nate read it once, then he looked up at the sheriff. Cyrus. There is a man in San Francisco named Edmund Vance. I know there is, Nate. The territorial marshal has had a wire on his desk for an hour. By tonight, there will be a federal warrant. Mr. Vance is going to spend the rest of his natural days in a federal penitentiary, and his company is going to be broken up and its assets sold to pay damages to every family in this valley. I am going to make very certain of it personally. Augustus Sinclair came out of the house behind Nate. Cyrus saw him for the first time. And you must be the dead man, he said. I must, Augustus said quietly. Welcome back to the living Mr. Sinclair. The territorial marshal would like a long word with you about the gentleman in San Francisco. I am at his service, Augustus said, for as long as he needs me. The arrests were made over the following 2 weeks. Edmund Vance was taken at his desk in the Montgomery block in San Francisco on a Tuesday afternoon. Mortimer Pembroke tried to flee Wolf Creek by stagecoach at sundown the day of the raid, but Sheriff Briggs was waiting for him at the way station 10 miles south of town and brought him in without firing a shot. Calvin Whitfield was arrested in Denver 2 weeks later for his part in the false death of Augustus Sinclair. The corrupt territorial judges, named in Catherine Doyle's articles, were quietly removed from their benches by the federal authorities within the month. The Petersons, who had fled to Iowa, received a letter telling them their land had been restored to them and they could come home if they wished. They wished. They came back. Tobias Brennan got a new dog, a border collie pup with one black ear and one white. He named her Henrietta after the man who had been buried on the rise above the cottonwoods. The pup followed him everywhere. The winter that followed was a quiet one in Wolf Creek Valley. Snow came early and lay deep. The Lazy H Ranch house, with its windows reglazed and its barn rebuilt with the help of every neighbor for 20 miles, settled into the long white silence of a Wyoming winter. Inside the house, life went on slowly, the way life does after a great storm. Abby and Augustus rebuilt their relationship a day at a time, the way she had said they would. He moved into a small cabin Toby and Ezra built for him on the rise near Henry's grave with a view of the whole valley. He took up stonework again, his old trade from before he had been a geologist, and through the long winter evenings, he carved a marble headstone for Henry by hand. The work took him 3 months. The stone, when it was finished, named Henry McCready, gave the years of his birth and his death, and below them carried 4 lines that called him a Union soldier, a friend and a father to sons not his own. Nate stood before the stone for a long time the day Augustus set it in place, his hat in his hands. Ezra went east in the early spring. Nate had used the ranch's reserves and a portion of the damages awarded to the Wolf Creek families to send the boy to Cornell University in New York to study to be a doctor of animals. Ezra wrote home every week. His letters were full of strange words and stranger ideas and a quiet new confidence. Toby read the letters aloud at the supper table. Jonah listened without speaking, but always asked Toby to read the funny parts twice. Jonah himself took back the deputy's badge that Cyrus Briggs offered him in early March. He pinned it to his coat without a word and went to work the next morning. He had decided in his quiet way that protecting innocent people was the only thing he was actually any good at, and he was tired of pretending otherwise. Toby fell in love with a young schoolteacher from Wolf Creek named Eliza Marsh, who had brown hair and quick, laughing eyes and was not afraid of him. He was very surprised by it. He went around for 2 weeks looking like a man who had been hit on the back of the head with a board. By April, he had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes. And on a clear, bright morning in May of 1880, beneath the wide cottonwood that grew at the corner of the ranch yard, Abigail and Nathaniel Hollister were married a second time. Reverend Josiah Matthews presided again. Toby stood as best man. Jonah stood beside him in his deputy's uniform. Augustus Sinclair walked his daughter up the aisle of folding chairs that the women of Wolf Creek had set out in the grass. Catherine Doyle was the matron of honor. Tobias Brennan sat in the front row with Henrietta the puppy curled at his feet. Ezra had come home from Cornell for the week. and stood beside his brothers in his first proper suit, taller than any of them remembered, with a new quiet steadiness in his eyes. When Reverend Matthews asked Nate the question this time, Nate did not say, "I do." He said, "With everything I have left in this world, I will." Abby's eyes filled up. She said her words back to him through them. When he kissed her, the small crowd in the grass cheered and threw handfuls of dried wildflowers. And Nate looked up over Abby's shoulder at the rise above the cottonwoods where Henry McCready lay under his white marble stone, and he whispered so quietly that only Abby and the wind could hear him. "You were right, old man, about all of it. Thank you." It was a year later in the spring of 1881 that Abby stood on the porch of the Lazy H Ranch House in the long red light of an evening just like the one when she had first arrived. She had one hand resting on the railing and the other resting low against the gentle round of her belly. The baby was due in 6 weeks. She was watching the Laramie Mountains turn purple in the dusk. Nate came out of the kitchen behind her and slid his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I was thinking about a girl in a kitchen in Philadelphia at 4 in the morning," she said. "I was thinking she could not have imagined this porch. I was thinking I should write her a letter and tell her to hold on." "You cannot send a letter backwards in time, Abigail." "I know." She laid her hand over his where it rested on her belly. "So I am going to do the next best thing. I am going to live this life so well that the girl I was would feel it across the years somehow, as a kind of warmth." Nate was quiet for a moment. Then he said very softly, "What will we name him if it is a boy?" "Henry," she said without hesitation. "We will name him Henry." Nate's arms tightened around her. He bent his head and kissed her hair. The sun went down behind the Laramie Mountains, and the first star came out over Wolf Creek Valley, and the lamps of the Lazy H Ranch House glowed warm and steady against the gathering night. "A man without something to fight for," old Henry McCready had said once on a porch in another lifetime, "is already half dead." A man with something to fight for, Nathaniel Hollister thought, now holding his wife and his unborn child against the fall of evening, is alive twice over. Once for himself and once for the people he loves. He held her until the stars came out.